morning, everyone. It is a particular pleasure to be here today to welcome you all to the second day of the conference, and a very warm welcome to Professor Tierney. Just to let you know, Professor, that yesterday the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Renuka Vital, and the Director, Dr. Rabi Danpath, extended a warm welcome to you in your absence. So just to remind you that it was done. And we are so grateful that you are here today. And of course, you all remember that Rabi spoke yesterday about Durban being the province, where the city where the sun never sets. Just to rectify a perception that he might have said a barefaced lie, or that he's suffering from some form of ignorance or dementia. But you know, it's a strike season. Even the sun has decided to strike, and it's refusing to rise. Hopefully that will end with the taxi strike, the burning on campus, and all the things that are happening. But of course, the burning of our campuses also says that we've all been warmed, and so we are really heartened to have you all here. So I have the pleasure of introducing you to Professor Tierney, who has had an illustrious career which continues, I suppose, for the next 20 years as well, and has a very distinguished CV. And if I had to read that to you, of course, we'd be here because it's long, it's more than 50 pages long. But just to give you a snapshot of his work and his stature, he's the director of the Pelagius Center for Higher Education. I hope I pronounced that correctly. At the University of Southern California. He's also a university professor and the Wilbur Kiefer Professor of Higher Education. And this he holds at the Rossier School of Education. Yay for education. You know, we're always seen as a Cinderella profession. And here we have an illustrious academic coming from our ranks. He is the past president of the American Educational Research Association, which I believe hosts the largest conference in education in the world. And of course, he teaches courses on administration and governance of higher education and qualitative research methods. He has published more than 200 articles in peer-reviewed journals, has written 12 books. Just to give you a snapshot of the titles, which are so seductive. New Players, Different Games. I must tell you, our rugby team, it's all players, same game. Building a Responsive Campus, The Web of Leadership, Academic Outlaws, many of us feel like that, and of course, a novel, Academic Affairs, a love story. We'd like to hear more about that. He's also edited 43 books. He has a tome on leadership, over 100 papers. You know, they say South Africa is the lowest achieving country in mathematics. I couldn't count beyond 100, so I'll just say over 100. Dozens of PhD graduates, and so it goes on and on. So we are really pleased to have you here, and certainly to shatter the idea that those who are old are technology cold. He also has his own blog site, a blog. And so really interesting reading there. I hand you over to Professor Tierney.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I have not been in South Africa before, actually Africa, except North Africa. A long time ago, I lived for 2 years in Morocco, but now I have gone to the other end of the continent. Let me give you just a second about myself so you understand the work and where I'm coming from. If you were to define all those different articles and things that I've written, other than the novel, really one part of me, and what I want to speak about this morning, has to do with access. How do we get more low-income, first-generation youth into university and graduate? And that has taken me in the last 10 or 15 years into high schools. I spend a great amount of time working with poor high school students and who have to figure out how to get into university and be prepared. The other part of me is concerned about innovation and change and strategic planning. My sense is that universities right now are going through as great changes as we have ever seen, certainly in the last 100 years. And I think there is a reflexive response on the part of many of us that we don't want to change. But really, I think we have to change. So I'm trying to figure out how do we do that. At the same time, I'm also concerned when I think about access with, are there other innovative strategies that we might use to improve access? So that part of me has taken me into dealing with technology and games online that I'll talk about in the workshop in the next session. The curiosity for me, I think, is that as an academic, I'm very interested in theory, but I spend a fair amount of time dealing with public policy at the state level and the federal level in the United States. And most importantly, I'm concerned about practice. That's what I'll talk about in the workshop. All my work can be as theoretical as can be, but if I do not improve the lives of our African American and Latino students in California and the nation, then what good is my work? So I work very hands-on with a lot of students and counselors and teachers in high schools. I should say also that I have traveled a fair amount. On Thursday, I'll go off to India, where I will be for the next 9 months. I have a Fulbright there, and I'll be looking at innovation and change in Indian higher education. And just to get started, I also want to say that we need to rethink these formats of a lecturer standing up here and lecturing at you. And all of my classes are with PhD students. I work heavily with graduate students, PhD students, and they all disagree with me. And I think that's great. So I have no problems as I move forward that you are going to disagree with one part or another. So please, I hope that I have time for questions at the end, certainly in that session this afternoon. So think about things that are provocative and ways that you see the world and I don't. And together I think we come forward with a sense of how do we move forward productively. Now my talk today will deal with several different words and concepts. And if I am successful, by the end of the presentation, these different ideas are going to be related to one another. If not, it's just a jigsaw puzzle that never made much sense to you. Now, what I want to do is think about access. Education has been seen as a key vehicle for a way out of poverty. During the 20th century, an elementary school education increased dramatically really throughout the world. And in most developed countries, a high school education in the 20th century became a requirement. A truism has been that the wealthier a country is, the better developed the educational system. Countries that have sought to improve the economic well-being have invested heavily in schooling. You can see that particularly right now in China. The assumption is that if a country's citizens wish to prosper, then the populace needs skills that are taught primarily in formal venues like schools. But less well established in the 20th century is what is the role of universities. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the purpose of tertiary education began to shift, largely in Europe and North America. In particular, a post-secondary education developed a dual purpose. It was not simply to better the mind, it was also to develop a job. Michael Gibbons has noted, gone is the high-mindedness of a von Humboldt or a Newman with its pursuit for knowledge for its own sake. In its place is an economic assumption that a well-educated citizenry benefits not only the individual, but the state. Now, I should say in the United States, that has been something that has guided us for the last century, for better or worse. That what we need are skills, and you learn skills in a university. My assumption is that we can't divorce skills from what I think of as citizenship skills, and that we need to put these two together. Now, although universities and post-secondary institutions have existed for centuries throughout the world, the history of higher education is also relatively recent in some countries. Oxford University, for example, began in 1096, while Peru's University was chartered in 1551. After World War II, tertiary education became somewhat more important in the developed world, but in the developing world, the emphasis remained on mass education geared toward primary and, to a certain extent, secondary education. Most countries in the world, however, by 1960 had a university. By the 1970s, many countries in Europe, Latin America, the United States, Canada not only had universities, but an elaborated system throughout the country. Tertiary education educated for the life of the mind and soul, but also as training grounds. Now, a significant transformation has occurred over the last generation with regard to the import and role of tertiary education. There is, in general, a common acceptance that a high school education is no longer sufficient for a society which wishes high-wage jobs in a global society. And I need to talk about globalization and technology in a minute. The increase does not only pertain to the number of students who graduate from high school and go on to college, it also concerns the expansion of post-secondary opportunities for adult students, an expansion of educational opportunities and formats that post-secondary students shall receive, and an expansion of the kind of learning experiences that students have in a university. First-generation college students make up an increasing share of students in higher education, and they graduate at a much lower rate than do students with university-educated parents. In the United States, it's a very simple prediction. If my son or daughter go to university, they're more likely to graduate simply because their parents have a university degree. But that's a very deterministic assumption. So what do we do? One response right now, which I want to speak about this morning, is coming to be known as grit, passion and perseverance for long-term goals in the face of setbacks. And it's been identified as an individual characteristic that's predictive of success. Although having grit may be helpful to poor students, the trait is likely not to be sufficient for college success. I want to consider the connection of the net with social capital and grit in terms of how we succeed. So the big question for me, the presentation pertains to one's reason for pursuing a goal, in this case a university degree, and I ask, how do first-generation low-income students find their purpose to succeed as university students? My answer is that they lie at the intersection of grit and social capital. Now, I want to think about grit as three interrelated components: passion and interest, preference for long-term goals, and the ability to overcome setbacks. Now, any of us who are parents certainly will agree with this for our child. We want them to be interested in education. We want them to think in long-term goals, not just what are you going to do today, but what are you going to do when you graduate from high school or university. And if a setback hits one of our kids, we want them to succeed. But saying that at an individual level is very different from assuming that that's the way things should work on a systemic level. And that's what we need to think about. So I first want to make the case for increasing access, then turn to a discussion and critique of grit and consider how it might interface with social capital. And ultimately, I'm going to argue that the role of the academic is not simply to acquiesce, but instead to engage in an analysis of the overall cultural politics that defines the era and proffer ways for social engagement. So let's get started. Different countries have different manpower needs. Now, this slide here is about California, my own state, where I've lived for the last 20 years, and I know it best. Obviously, in terms of understanding person power needs, you have to have data. In California, we have lots of data. Estimates are that by 2019, over 385,000 additional individuals will be interested in enrolling as undergraduates in a public post-secondary institution. So we will have in the state of California about 2.75 million students. Now, President Obama has pointed out that the United States is no longer number one in industrialized countries in terms of students going to college and graduating from college. And for us, that's a problem. Why is it a problem? It's a problem not simply because we want to be number one, but the assumptions are, given manpower, person power needs in 2025, that we're going to need more individuals with some form of a post-secondary degree. And I want to emphasize, I am not saying that everybody needs to get a 4-year degree, much less a master's degree or a doctorate. What we need is, in the estimate in California is that we need about 61% of our high school graduates to get some form of post-secondary degree. Now, we do know a couple things about high school graduates and university graduates. We know that unemployment is higher amongst high school graduates, and it's in the United States and in California, it is really a requirement for students, if you want to maintain your livelihood in the workforce, to have at least a high school degree. But and it's not a bed of roses either in a globalized world that everybody's going to have a job. But really, if we are concerned about providing educational opportunity for low-income individuals, we need more people participating in higher education. In California, the assumption is that we need about 1 million more people than we currently have planned participating in higher education by 2025. So the assumption right now is if we continue the way we're going, we will increase somewhat, but we will still fall 1 million students short in California. Now, that's neither good for the state, the country, or the individual. We also know that during the recession, unemployment was a problem, and it wasn't that everyone who had a bachelor's degree had a job, but they were hit less worse than those who had a high school degree. You can see here, in terms of the unemployment rates, that what happened. We know, therefore, that graduates not only earn more, but the need for a better educated workforce will grow. Now, I can say that with near certainty in California and the United States. I cannot speak about the needs of South Africa. But as a beginning, we need to know that. Because recognize that I'm saying we need 1 million more students and we need 61% of our high school graduates to go to university or some form of post-secondary education. It could be a technical college. It could be a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree. But 61% is not 100%. So we know that there are service jobs that are needed, and those service jobs students need a high school degree. Because of the expected retirement as well of well-educated workers, the state will have 3.3 million jobs requiring a post-secondary credential. But we're only going to have 2.2 million workers. Now, the implications for California are significant. Because of a lack of skilled workers, the state will fall short in economic competitiveness. Some, but not many, have argued that the status quo is sufficient. And I see this on both ends of the spectrum, those on the far left and those on the far right. And the argument on the far right, the conservatives, is to say, well, not everyone needs a college degree. But they don't address who they're saying that about. Because if we're saying not everyone needs a college degree, a university degree, they're not talking about the upper class. They're not talking about their children. They're talking about poor children. So it's okay for us to get a university degree. It's just those people over there who don't need a university degree. And this is where it's not simply job training, it's also we need to decide about these things. And if we're going to disrupt narratives, what are we going to do in schools, in low-income schools where there's not a very high university going rate, to change things? Now, I should also say, by way of biography, when I graduated from high school, I went to a liberal arts university. I majored in literature and creative writing, hence the novel. I never thought once about what type of job I was going to have. I'm still not particularly sure. But I'm old enough to know that's the way it worked then, that there were jobs out there, and if you had a bachelor's degree in literature, you'd find something. And then I got a master's degree in education, and I worked on a Native American reservation for 2 years because I thought I could help change the world in the United States. But I liked to read, so I said, well, I guess I'll get a doctorate. I was not strategic at all. But now when I work with my own graduate students, or I work with high school students, the strategic needs are so different. And it's because of this definition that I want to talk to in terms of globalization. I think sometimes we think of globalization as a synonym. It could be a synonym for capitalism, Americanism, Westernization, American values. But I really think that globalization is also more than simply the transmutation of economic and social values from one country to the next. That simply because every country has a McDonald's, that means globalization. Now these fellows, Held and McGrew, suggest that globalization is the widening, deepening, and speeding up of worldwide interconnectedness in all aspects of contemporary social life. And again, those of us who are old enough know what that means. In terms of my arrangements, Ruby and I never met. We never sent any paper. We never even talked on the telephone. Really, all we did was send one another a great many emails back and forth. It's the sort of thing that when I started out never would have happened. The thought of being strategic in school in terms of what one studies and how one studies really was not needed in a world where jobs were easy to get. None of these presumably instrumental actions, such as trade policy or technology transfer, are a decultured medium that merely drive transnational development. When I go to India, I'll be on sabbatical. My previous sabbatical, I was in Malaysia, and I was trying to understand globalization in a country such as Malaysia. Because I think far too often when we think of globalization, we think in a very large, very hard to understand how does that impact. And what I did was several life histories of individuals in a developing country in terms of what does that mean for you? How does it impact you? Because globalization ultimately gets impacted at the national level, at the state level. Such a viewpoint stands in contradiction from what Sclair has labeled those who speak of globalization suffused with a good deal of fatalism, popularly known as TINA. There is no alternative philosophy. I actually think there are a great many alternatives. I said a moment ago that we're going through as great changes as any time in the last century. We can look at that as fear, or we can look at it as a sense of optimism. I'm not a status quo sort of guy, so the thought that we can change things is exciting to me, but we have to recognize the problems and then move on. Now, globalization then refers to practices that extend beyond national borders, even though they are frequently enacted in local and national contexts. Globalization has come about and is spread by capital migration and technology. The result is greater integration across sectors and countries. We have a global EDD at my university that I teach in, and 3/4 of it is online. I could have a student, I don't, unfortunately, I could have a student in that program who is in South Africa. And once a year for a week, you would come to Los Angeles or Hong Kong. But we have students in that program from all around the world. Again, that sort of interaction would have been impossible, even 10 years ago, unthinkable. And the technology is not as good as I would want it to be, but it is a hell of a lot better than it was 10 years ago, and you can know that 10 years from now it will be even stronger. Education is a useful example, I think, for the breadth of globalization, because education's reach transcends one or another category. Education not only is transformed, but as knowledge-producing organizations, schools and universities transform our organizations and understanding of globalization itself. A central derivative of globalization has been rethinking of what we mean by a public good. And this is where a challenge comes in for us. As I noted a minute ago, education has always been seen as important in countries. In the 19th and early 20th century, however, the obligation for educating the citizenry was the state's. Globalization has shifted from a public obligation to a private need. Any review of how capital has functioned will see the coercive nature of the state in an earlier era, but over the last half-century, the welfare state has assumed a more direct role in education than is seen now, which is why assessment becomes so important. The advent of globalization has continued this trend insofar as education has become a prominent factor in how analysts view the prosperity of a nation. But that responsibility today has become privatized rather than as public good. How one interprets education in the age of globalization has two significant differences. The school and university has been public institutions supported by the taxpayer. The assumption has been that the individual and society benefit from better educated citizenry. But I just read this morning in my own newspaper back home, the Los Angeles Times, that there is a proposal that half of our public schools become privatized within the next 10 years. We are the second largest school district in the United States. And what they want is they want money from foundations, the Gates Foundation, the Ford Foundation, to make this happen. Globalization and its neoliberal supporters have turned these ideas upside down. Education in the industrialized world, as best exemplified by the United States and Australia, is becoming privatized. So rather than assume that education benefits everyone, we're assuming that it only benefits you. And this is where the idea of grit comes in. So let me talk a bit about that. If an individual encounters difficulty as a student, the responsibility for the student's success or failure from this perspective rests with the individual. Student achievement depends upon the individual. That's why assessment has become so darn important. Society is merely the field where action happens, and schools are simply parochial locales in that field. Fiscal support, the existence of teacher unions, a concern for democratic pedagogy, and the like take a back seat. Competition is good from this perspective, and dramatic reforms are needed. Now, my goal here is to consider how what I shall call responsibilization frames a radically different version of the public good. I think of responsibilization as assigning the burden of managing one's risks in society solely within the autonomous individual rather than the state. The idea of responsibilization has led to an emphasis on students' self-discipline, determination, and grit. And again, the language that we develop, I'm old enough to know it's very difficult with this sort of argument to be against it. Again, as a parent, who would not want their child to be responsible? Who doesn't want their child to work hard? But 25 years ago, the literature was about effectiveness and efficiency, that our organizations need to be more effective and they need to be more efficient. And we had the same sort of challenges. And the problem, again, in terms of language development is, how do you speak against that? Who wants inefficient organizations or ineffective organizations? So we can't simply accept the language that's put upon us. We need to think about these things. Although hard work and determination are not new concepts in education, the specific construct called grit was situated in the psychology literature in 2007 and is currently quite in vogue. Having the capability of sustaining effort and interest in assignments over long periods of time is seen as a perspective of a gritty student, one who is likely to succeed in the new school environment. If we assume, Angela Duckworth, who's a prominent psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania, is really the person who is the doyen of grit. If we assume at the grit skill that grit is a function of consistency of interest and perseverance of effort, then it begs the question, who is responsible for these two goals? Is a student always to blame for not continually exerting effort despite teachers' instructions to do so? Although issues of race, class, gender are not often examined extensively in the literature of grit in psychology, considering grit from a sociocultural perspective is useful, especially in educational contexts, and has direct ties to authors such as Anna Yateman. She writes of mutual obligations where individual actors need to determine their future rather than remain passive. I cannot create change for you, but I can help in my classrooms to create the conditions for change. That puts a very different spin on who's responsible for what's happening. Moving away from the Keynesian welfare state, individuals now become responsible for their future with the idea of grit. A focus on grit at this moment in history is not merely serendipity, but rather ties into the idea that individuals are responsible for their success. If one succeeds, it is the individual's benefit. If one fails, it's his or her failure. The role of society is largely absent. Now, I should also point out that this rhetoric is very different in the United States from the conservative rhetoric of traditional family values. Conservative commentary still highlights that learning is mediated by numerous constituencies: teachers, parents, the church. The governmentality literature, however, and with it the idea of responsibilization, atomizes identity. Rather than a state that takes overt actions of control, the responsibilization of the individual comes into focus. The state's responsibility is not to educate, but to assess. The result is that when negative actions happen, illness, unemployment, the responsibility lies not with the government or the state, but the individual. The assumption is if students work hard, they will succeed. Because what counts for knowledge is presumably everyone is on the same level. We have a level playing field. Now, those of us who work in the sorts of schools that I work on find that a tall order to digest, that we all work on, in Los Angeles, for those of you who know Beverly Hills, that the kids who go to Beverly Hills High School have the same playing field as the kids who I work with at Belmont High School. Responsibilization essentially requires people to be accountable for managing their own risk in society. As such, notions of autonomy and individualism are coupled with extremely authoritarian ways of viewing individuals. Such an outcome has a picture of winners and losers. The state has moved from a focus on the welfare of all citizenry to a consumerist model where one's success gets determined in a singular fashion. I'm arguing that the pattern that exists, although certainly having lineaments to a conservative discourse surrounding the individual, the family, and the nation, is also new, in large part because of the rise of neoliberal globalization and the rapid expansion of social media, connecting individuals globally. Foucault accurately predicted the pervasive force of governmentality, and Bourdieu's notion of cultural and social capital have shown how those who are marginalized stay on the margins by the invisible force of capital. What they could not have predicted, Foucault and Bourdieu, is how the individual had become atomized in the 21st century. The state regulates not by force, regulation, or policies. Instead, globalization has enabled the market to reign supreme. The interpretation of that with regard to schools and universities can be seen by a desire for tests and assessment that have multiple ramifications. In the United States, we use the phrase of high-stakes testing. Again, some win, some lose. Curricula gets translated as instrumentalities to be learned, but I've got a different way of thinking about this. Now let me talk for a minute about social capital. It's a framework that enables or disables individuals and groups, and I think we need to recognize that the use of capital is purposeful. Just as economic capital enables an individual entree into certain arenas, and human capital pertains to skills an individual has with regard to employment, social capital facilitates movement. My own sense is the students that I work with in high schools also, capital gets spent so that I can arrange, facilitate social capital networks for my students so that they get themselves into university, but that capital that they've had has been spent. So then what are we in universities doing to generate additional capital so that students have networks that facilitate learning in education in the university? Examples of social capital are resources developed within a network of relationships of mutual acquaintances. An elite private high school is an example of an organization that has multiple opportunities for individuals to acquire social capital. Students participate with one another in an array of college preparation, university preparation activities. Visits with one's peers to cultural entities such as museums will be commonplace. Many of the students that I work with in inner city Los Angeles at the age of 18, when they're about to apply for university, have never stepped on a university campus. Think about that. In a city such as Los Angeles, where a university is only 4 kilometers from where they live and work, live and study. The school will sponsor field trips to visit colleges and universities, but that's a far cry from students who have come from wealthy families that just naturally believe that they belong at a university and have gone there quite often. Networks matter. In a low-income high school, the opposite sort of scenario is easy to draw. If college preparation begins at all, it will begin in the last year of high school. In the next session, I want to talk about specific steps about what we can change. Obviously, social and economic capital are interrelated. The development of one is likely to facilitate the acquisition of the other. The social capital that a student acquires in high school, for example, may not make the individual economically wealthier today, but it has the potential of creating networks that will help him or her tomorrow. Membership in a group has social obligations that provide benefits to the individual, such as a credential or contacts that can be utilized in the future. A member has certain obligations, such as a dress code and norms of behavior, but in turn, the individual will be in an exclusive network that increases his or her social capital. Networks are also frequently multiple and overlapping. Individuals who are in a country club may have attended similar universities, participated in the same fraternity or sorority, or frequented the same cultural events. Pierre Bourdieu looked at such network development and concluded that social capital is a primary explanation of how inequality flourishes. Memberships, argued Bourdieu, are exclusionary and provide not only avenues for wealth creation, but barriers to equality. So what I'm thinking here is that we need to put these two ideas together. Those who are poor have many networks in their lives. We also need to be careful when we're speaking from this perspective that we're not emphasizing or painting a portrait of what I think of as a culture of poverty. Those who are poor have many networks in their lives. Families, social and fraternal organizations, churches, to name a few. The type of network in which one resides, however, provides different sources of support. The challenge is to enable those who are poor to have access to network development that facilitates a path out of poverty. Rather than an individual approach that suggests an individual needs to improve his or herself by way of grit, and if the individual does not, well, tough luck for you, the framework I'm suggesting argues that individuals have the potential to exist in networks that enable the acquisition of social capital. In poor community, those networks need to be consciously created and fostered. And how do we do that? How do we move forward with that? Social organizations such as schools have a crucial role to play in the facilitation of networks. Rather than the motto being, yes, I can, it really needs to be, yes, we can. So how do we proceed? The concept of responsibilization might be criticized not only for implying a degree of passivity of those being responsibilized, but also for denying agency to individuals. The point, of course, is not to deny individual responsibility, but to problematize the actions of individuals, schools, and the state. We need to acknowledge the issues regarding globalization for education, regarding assessment, and then consider what an engaged intellectual might do. Rather than assume that the nature of social relations is preordained, such that issues such as assessment or grit are givens, that's the way the world works, I'm suggesting transformation is possible. The role of the academic is not to move away from being a transmitter of knowledge, but figure out how to create change. As Henry Giraud has noted, ideology becomes useful for understanding not only how schools sustain and produce meanings, but also how individuals and groups produce, modify, or resist them. And there lies the challenge. The responsibility of the academic is to help focus dialogue on the reconstruction of the social imagination in order to advance a cultural politics of democracy that honors diverse voices rather than subscribes to notions of responsibilization. The struggle to understand how responsibilization functions, then, is a key responsibility for the engaged academic. A simple understanding of how a coercive force operates is not enough. Simply at the theoretical level, if that's all we're working on, is not sufficient today. The thought of an academic in an ivory tower removed from society is no longer sufficient. We must develop ways that enable those who are on the margins to develop strategies to gain control of their lives. Strategies to develop grit in children may be well-intended and may succeed for a child, but my point is that responsibilization strategies may work for someone but nevertheless function in a way that does not allow systemic reform. My assumption is that when an educational organization's discursive strategies are about common goals to enable diverse voices rather than homogeneous ones by way of standardized assessments, faculty and staff will move closer to creating bonds of reciprocal obligation. We're all in this together. Some may suggest that moving against standardized curricula and assessments or responsibilized strategies that atomize the individual is wishful thinking rather than strategic design. From this perspective, complete understandings of how governmentality functions and how to overcome it is impossible. But if the answer to ideology cannot be solved, it can be thought about, which is what I hope we're trying to do this morning and here. We can strive to reach greater clarity about the issue and in the process, better locate ourselves in the world. The responsibility, then, of the academic is aimed not at fitting into the agenda that has been designed for us, but instead focusing on creating a society without injustice. Our project becomes transformative, of consequence innovative, rather than maintaining the status quo. The cultural politics of academic staff struggles to create the conditions for a better world. Such a stance may seem utopian, or a liberal's lament from a modernist age, but I do remain wedded to Henry Giroud's notion that human beings not only make history, but also make the constraints. And needless to say, we also can unmake them. It needs to be remembered that power is an enabling as well as a constraining force. Ideas such as responsibilization, standardized assessment measures, and grit are not created whole cloth by the invisible force impervious to change. Our challenge is to develop a democratic public philosophy that works against homogenization and instead honors difference in a way to enact a common struggle that is emancipatory as process and outcome. We need a multiplication of democratic practices that enable diverse social relations based on a multitude of subject positions fraught with issues pertaining to power and privilege. The challenge is not simply to provide skills for those who are powerless in a zero-sum game so that the structural relations of power remain the same. Our collective responsibility to one another, and especially to our students, is to create the conditions required for a reconfigured democratic public sphere. And this sphere enables voice and a diversity of public stances formed by a renewed sense of obligation to one another. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tierney. We have just 10 minutes, which leaves us to perhaps an opportunity to answer just one question. But if you have a burning issue that you feel needs to be responded to, please feel free to make a note of it and to give it to me. We will be following this up with a video recording with Professor Tierney, a panel discussion. And so those questions can then be taken up at that forum. So anyone with a brilliant question? Thank you. Would you give us your name and pose your question?
Good morning. Thank you, Professor. I'm not sure if it's a brilliant question, but it is a question. My name is Manuela. I would just like to know, so if we are now, if we have communities of practice, what should we then be talking about on a practical level? If we walk out of this venue today and we need to integrate what you have said, how do we go about it on a practical level? Where would you suggest we start? Thank you.
Thank you for that.
That's a good question. Again, I can't speak to the conditions in South Africa. I do know in the United States that there is a vast divide between high school teachers and university professors. And oftentimes the assumption is that university professors have the knowledge, and they just need to give them to the high school teachers and students, and then things will be okay. I find that a total mistake. There has to be a closer integration between K through 12 education, primary and secondary education, and tertiary education. If you look at the 20th century throughout the world, an artifact of it is that there was a sharp delineation between K through 12 education and post-secondary education. My assumption is that an artifact of the 21st century is there'll be a much closer relationship between secondary and tertiary education. If that is the case, then universities need to be much more involved in the lives of their schools, the welfare of their schools, than they are now. And they need to be involved in a way that is not Moses coming down from the mountaintops telling teachers and principals and students what they need to do. So that's a start.
Thank you for that. I think we'll end it here, so I'll just make a few concluding remarks. I read somewhere that for every complex problem, there is a clear, simple, and wrong answer. And I think that certainly came out today, that the issue of access is so complex, it's so entangled with so many different issues that to try to isolate it and to reduce it, as we did yesterday, to an issue of funding would be a tragedy. We really have to delve deep into the issue of access, and it's not just access to education. Perhaps it refers to issues like access to respect and fairness and justice. And those are the things that we should be concerned about. And I'm sure that this debate will not end. But it has certainly been, we've certainly been given enough information to start looking at our own context and how we should deconstruct it to find solutions that work in our context. So thank you for making us aware that education is important and that it's not only important for some, but for others it is absolutely critical for survival. And a final thank you once again.